dust, darkness, and one secret the sands refused to bury. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Your presence makes this journey special. Now, the case unfolds. By all appearances, the Flaxborough Horticultural and Floral Society's annual show promised little in the way of excitement. A drizzle, thin as the tea in the refreshment tent, descended upon the bunting that drooped across the market hall entrance. Inside, rows of chrysanthemums, dahlias, and the occasional gladiolus leaned in perfect obedience to their class cards, while the judges, most of whom had been judges for so long that impartiality had hardened into habit, proceeded with mild sighs of duty. Mrs. Enid Bullimore, the mayor's wife, presided at the door in a lilac two-piece that suggested an uneasy compromise between civic dignity and church raffle glamour. She greeted every entrant as though they had come to apologize for something. "Ah, Mrs. Larch. Not competing this year? Well, one must know one's limits, mustn't one?" By mid-afternoon, conversation in the tea tent had reached its usual theme, the relative moral standing of those absent. Mr. Cuttle, who kept the chemist's shop, was seen whispering to his assistant that Mrs. Dabb's prize fuchsias looked suspiciously vigorous for plants that had been nursed through the frost. Meanwhile, in the corner nearest the weighing scales, Councillor Harcourt had just taken possession of the raffle's second prize, a book of railway timetables, 1968 edition, and was wondering aloud whether the first prize, a set of crystal sherry glasses, might yet be declared void on grounds of impropriety. Then came the interruption that would, in due time, occupy Inspector Purbright for the better part of a week. It was Mrs. Withins, the vicar's wife, who gave the first alarm, though alarm is perhaps overstating it, for her tone was more indignant than frightened. "Really? Someone has left the church display case unlocked again." The display case in question, a glass-topped oak affair normally housing the parish's modest collection of antiquities. Roman pottery shards, a Tudor chalice base, and one oddly shaped bone that had long enjoyed the label possibly Saxon, stood near the entrance. The bone, however, was gone. In its place lay something wrapped in yellowing linen, the end of which protruded like a tongue from an envelope. Who on earth would do such a silly thing? Mrs. Withins demanded. Mr. Cuttle, drawn by curiosity and a vague sense that someone might need smelling salts, leaned over. "Good heavens. Looks like a bit of an old bandage, doesn't it?" When the linen was unwrapped by Councillor Harcourt, who considered himself immune to drama, it revealed a small, dark, desiccated hand. A child's hand. By tea-time, the police had arrived, though without sirens or the smallest sense of urgency. The discovery, while macabre, was unlikely to disturb the peace more than the annual tax reassessments. Inspector Purbright appeared an hour later, unhurried as always. His arrival was noted chiefly by the custodian of the urn, who remarked that he didn't look the type for heavy lifting. Purbright regarded the object with mild interest, as though it were an overcooked sausage. "Would it," he asked Sergeant Malley, "be too fanciful to suppose it's a museum exhibit that's lost its label?" "Could be, sir," Malley replied, "though Mrs. Withins says it weren't there this morning when she arranged the parish notices." Purbright nodded, expression unreadable. "Then perhaps," he said, "we might inquire whose hand was there this morning." Mrs. Withins gasped at what she took for flippancy, but Purbright's eyes had already moved on, taking in the faces, the sidelong glances, the eager retelling of details that no one could possibly have observed. By the next morning, the hand had acquired a legend. At the Fatted Calf public house, one version had it that the thing was Egyptian, part of a mummy smuggled back by some long-dead colonel. Another swore it belonged to a local child, what went missing in 1923. By noon, even Mrs. Bullimore had decided it was not impossible that blackmail might be involved. Inspector Purbright, over a quiet lunch of steak and kidney pie in the police canteen, made no contribution to any of these theories. His thoughts, if he entertained any, were occupied less with the hand itself than with the manner of its discovery. Someone, he reflected, had wanted that hand to be found by a particular kind of audience in a particular kind of setting, and in Flaxborough few things were more public or more respectable than the annual flower show. By the following morning, the hand had migrated from the police evidence room to every breakfast table in Flaxborough, at least in conversation. Housewives discussed it over marmalade, shopkeepers over their tills, and Mr. Harcourt, who fancied himself something of an amateur historian, lectured his corner of the fatted calf bar on the funerary customs of the 18th dynasty, until even the landlord began to polish glasses more loudly than necessary. In the High Street, Mrs. Bullimore encountered Mrs. Withens outside the baker's and declared, with mournful satisfaction, that the affair had an unpleasantly foreign aspect. Mrs. Withens, who was determined that no shadow of paganism should fall upon the church's display cabinet, insisted it must be nothing more than an anatomical specimen mislaid by some careless medical person. It was this statement, relayed, embroidered, and circulated, that reached Inspector Purbright through the less official channels of intelligence which every provincial constabulary cultivates: barbers, vergers, and taxi drivers. By 11 o'clock, he and Sergeant Malley were seated in the small office adjoining the police station's charge room, with the mysterious hand laid out on a white cloth before them. The forensic officer from the county headquarters had already pronounced, with cautious brevity, that the object was indeed human, probably female, and very old. He could not, however, say how old, nor how it had come to be wrapped so neatly in the linen now folded beside it. Purbright examined the bandage with mild curiosity. A good deal of care went into this, he remarked, turning the strip over between thumb and forefinger. Not the sort of wrapping one associates with practical jokes. Malley nodded. No one seems to think it's a joke, sir. They're saying it's a curse, or something from a tomb. Ah, said Purbright, placing the linen down carefully. The public mind always prefers a curse to a prank. It lends a little dignity to its alarm. He sat back. Who had access to the church case, do we know? Mrs. Withens keeps the key, but she says the verger borrows it sometimes, and the verger, Mr. Cribb, says he left it on the vestry hook, same as always. The key, I mean. Purbright regarded Malley mildly. Then we have the whole parish equipped for archaeology. He rose. Let's pay our respects to Mr. Cribb. The verger was discovered in the church porch, polishing a brass candlestick with devotional zeal. He was a small, wiry man with a face perpetually on the brink of complaint. His view of the world was that of a caretaker besieged by the carelessness of others. The thing is, Inspector, he said when questioned, I locked that case proper after Mrs. Withens arranged the display for the show. I even checked the catches myself. It's that young fellow from the Historical Society what's been nosing about, Mr. Liversedge. He's always after borrowing bits for his exhibits. Never puts 'em back tidy. Purbright inclined his head. So, Mr. Liversedge has a key. Oh, he'd not need one, said Cribb darkly. He's clever with a screwdriver, that one. Thinks locks are an insult to scholarship. Back at the station, Purbright made a note of the name and then telephoned the librarian, who confirmed that Mr. Ambrose Liversedge was indeed secretary of the Flaxborough Historical and Antiquarian Society. He lived above the newsagents, possessed an enthusiasm for early British burial rites, and was, according to the librarian, the sort of man who might make a dreadful discovery and immediately write a leaflet about it. Purbright and Malley climbed the narrow stairs to Mr. Liversedge's flat after luncheon. They found its occupant surrounded by stacks of pamphlets, cardboard boxes labelled "Findings Unverified," and a half-eaten pork pie. Liversedge himself was a thin, earnest man whose spectacles made his eyes appear perpetually astonished. "A hand, you say?" he repeated when told of the object. "Ah, Extraordinary. But I assure you I've never seen such a thing. I'd have remembered, certainly. Purbright smiled faintly. We thought perhaps it might have been part of your society's material. The wrapping seemed professional. Liversedge shook his head, then hesitated. Though, now you mention it, one of our members did speak of a specimen, some curiosity from a private collection. Mrs. Clayforth, I believe, lives on Fenwick Lane. Her late husband was in the diplomatic service, or so she claims. Does she indeed? Said Purbright. He allowed the remark to drift for a moment. And what was she proposing to do with it? Donate it to the church display, she said. Thought it would add a touch of antiquity. I told her it wasn't quite the done thing, displaying human remains among communion cups, but she only laughed. Purbright thanked him and departed, leaving Liversedge to resume his meal and his pamphlets. Outside, the inspector paused at the top of the stairwell. A specimen from a private collection, he murmured. How very educational our little town is becoming. They found Mrs. Clayforth at home, or at least present, which was not precisely the same thing. Her drawing room resembled a museum curated by someone who distrusted dusting. Glass-fronted cabinets displayed porcelain elephants, stuffed birds, and an alarming number of framed autographs. She received the visitors with a fluttering politeness that suggested she had been expecting them ever since breakfast. The hand. Oh dear, yes, she said, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. I suppose I am to blame. It was part of my husband's collection, brought back from Egypt in 1937, I think. I meant to lend it for the display, only I couldn't find the label. Such things are quite proper in museums, you know. Perfectly respectable. Purbright inclined his head gravely. And you took it to the church yourself? Well, not exactly. I mentioned it to young Mr. Liversedge, and he said he'd arrange everything. I packed it up carefully and left it by the gate for him to collect. I see. And when was that? The day before the flower show. I remember because the milkman was late. When they left, Mally exhaled a long breath. Seems straightforward enough, sir. Probably just a mix-up. Possibly, Purbright said. Though I wonder why Mrs. Clayforth didn't mention the hand to anyone after it went missing. Most ladies would have made something of a scene. Mally frowned. You think there's more to it? Purbright's expression was bland. I think, he said, that the dead hand of ancient Egypt may be grasping something rather more local. And with that, he turned his steps back toward the station, where a faint, thoughtful smile touched his lips as the church clock struck 3. Sergeant Mally, who had learned to interpret the droop of his superior's eyelids as a sign of increasing activity rather than fatigue, was dispatched with quiet instructions before he had reached for his hat again. He went first to Fenwick Lane. The Clayforth gate, a wrought iron arch with a taste for squeaking, looked out upon the pavement like an elderly aunt disapproving of traffic. Mrs. Clayforth's neighbor, a retired draper named Mr. Pitchford, was trimming his hawthorn hedge with the grave deliberation of a man completing a term of national service. Asked about parcels? He brightened. He had, he said, seen a brown paper package with string lying just inside the gate at about 9 the previous morning. A boy on a bicycle, one of the newsagent's fleet, had paused, whistled at it, and ridden on. A quarter of an hour later, Mr. Pitchford observed a motor car draw up. Councillor Harcourt's sober grey Austin. The councillor himself did not alight, but a passenger. The thin gentleman with the spectacles. I've seen him in the library. Stepped out, opened the gate, and removed the parcel with the delicacy of a person who regards string as an instrument of scholarship. Mally, with inward satisfaction, took down the description. Ambrose Liversedge, then, had collected the parcel after all. Back at the station, he found Inspector Purbright seated at his desk, turning the folded strip of linen beneath the desk lamp as though it were a landscape of faint but significant features. The frayed edge, Purbright remarked, is not frayed at all. It's hemmed, quite neatly with machine stitching, And do you notice these pale specks that catch the light? Hardly dust. Wax, I think. He paused. And this, very faint but present. A laundry stamp, SLCH. The letters crowd each other, as if accustomed to a small space. St. Luke's Cottage Hospital, Mally ventured. One would hope so, said Purbright, unless there is another institution in Flaxborough that launders hemmed linen and has taken vows of abbreviation. Mally reported Mr. Pitchford's observations. Purbright listened without interrupting, then allowed silence to settle like a cloth over a table. Mr. Liversedge assures us, he said at length, that he has never seen such a hand. His assurance may be entirely sincere. He may have collected a parcel believing it to contain a respectable oddity, and delivered it accordingly. But where did he deliver it? To the market hall, sir. He said he arranged everything. Everything is a large country. Purbright rose. Let us ask the market hall to define it. The caretaker at the hall, a slow man named Brant, whose chief article of faith was that nothing should be moved without a form, confirmed that Mr. Liversedge had arrived late in the morning with a package. He had asked that it be kept in the steward's cupboard until the church display was readied. Brant, who never entrusted keys to anybody younger than the reign of George V, placed the parcel on the lower shelf himself and locked the door. An hour later, when Mrs. Withens requested the cupboard be opened so that the flower arrangements might be displayed unmussed by idle hands, the package was no longer there. Brant had been affronted by this, but the affront, like all his emotions, had been quiet and private. Who had keys? Purbright asked. Only me, sir, and Mrs. Bullimore, seeing as she's the mayor's wife, and Mr. Brigsby, the hall steward. But he was at his dinner. Mrs. Bullimore received them at the townhouse, where she was orchestrating a tea in honor of a visiting chorale from Peterborough. She supported the conversation with glances more expressive than her words. Yes, she possessed a key to the steward's cupboard, as befitted her office. No, she had not opened it that day. She had been occupied with sherry glasses and the management of ladies with lively opinions. If anything had gone missing, she felt it only proper that the caretaker should account for it. Did you know, Purbright inquired gently, that a parcel left in that cupboard disappeared before you requested its contents? She lifted her eyebrows with a delicacy that might have frightened sparrows. Inspector, in the conduct of civic events, parcels appear and vanish in a manner that would astonish a prestidigitator. We manage. It is what culture requires. At St. Luke's Cottage Hospital, the matron, Miss Pendry, a woman whose posture suggested she had been pressed overnight between the pages of a rules manual, confirmed that some altar linen from St. Michael's had, in earlier years, been sent to the hospital laundry when the parochial system failed to remove wax to the matron's satisfaction. Old habits persisted. Only last week, a small bundle had been returned with a note from the vicarage asking that its edges be rehemmed. Miss Pendry remembered the task because she had rebuked the sewing-room nurse for a careless stitch. "And would any of your staff have access to surplus linen?" Purbright asked. "My staff," said Miss Pendry, "have access to nothing surplus." Nevertheless, a nurse named Pratt, pale and eager to be believed, recalled lending a length of worn linen to the verger, Mr. Cribb, for polishing brass. He had, she said, mentioned the flower show and asked whether old cloth absorbed wax better than new. She thought it a curious concern in a man so often uncurious. The verger, fetched from his brasses with some reluctance, denied remembering any such loan, but memory was never his strongest liturgical virtue. He did, however, recollect that Mrs. Withens had sent him back to the steward's cupboard not long after noon because some fool had mislaid the tax for the parish notices. He had gone, he admitted, and found the door already unlocked. "So I locked it," he said virtuously, "so as not to encourage sin." "Very proper," said Purbright, whose gaze rested mildly on the man's hands. They were clean, which in Cribb's trade was itself an irregularity. And who, besides yourself, would have an interest in the tax? The vicar's curate, said Cribb promptly. Young Mr. Teversham makes notices whenever there's a chance of a notice being made. Teversham, when gently pressed, confessed to a talent for pins and tacks, but denied any acquaintance with parcels, hands, or ancient Egypt. His chief worry was the arrangement of folding chairs and the spiritual consequences of mildew. He had, he said, opened no cupboards, though he had admired their hinges. By late afternoon, the lines of movement formed a neat but unhelpful pattern. A parcel collected from Fenwick Lane by an honest pedant, deposited under lock, removed under Culture's nose, reappearing in a church case wrapped in linen with a hospital stamp and studded with candle wax, like a small relic coached for public life. Purbright, who disliked patterns that behaved too well, stood at his office window and watched the street concede the day to evening. "It is the tidiness that disturbs me," he said. "People who intend a muddle rarely achieve such economy." Malley glanced up from his notes. "Then someone meant it all along?" "Someone meant us to see a line," Purbright replied. "I'm looking for the smudge that shows where the pencil rested." The following morning brought no enlightenment, only drizzle. Flaxborough's rain had the patient quality of an auditor. It fell without fuss, checked every corner, and never hurried. Inspector Purbright arrived at his desk to find Sergeant Malley already there, solemnly reading the morning's Chronicle, which had devoted its front page to "The Mummy's Hand Mystery, Police Pursue Leads." The story, filled with sentences that managed to be both breathless and sleepy, credited an anonymous source close to the investigation with the statement that occult influences were not excluded. Purbright took off his hat and placed it carefully on the peg. "Ah," he said mildly. "We've entered the supernatural phase." Malley looked up, defensive. "Wasn't me, sir. They make it up from bits overheard." "Bits," Purbright repeated. "That seems about right." He sat, steepling his fingers. "Still, I must confess, it may do us some good. Whoever arranged this little performance might feel encouraged to add a flourish or two once the audience is properly primed." Before noon, the first flourish arrived in the form of a call from Mrs. Clayforth. Her voice, trembling with self-pity, informed Purbright that she had received a letter. It was anonymous. Typed, Inspector, in that dreadful mechanical way. And it said, quite bluntly, "Return what is not yours." She had no idea what it meant, though she suspected certain elements of the Historical Society were attempting to blackmail her. Purbright promised to call at once. He found her pale and tremulous in her over-furnished drawing room. The letter lay upon a tea tray between the milk jug and the ginger biscuits. It was short, unsigned, and contained no address, though the typewriter ribbon had left an uneven imprint on the paper, a machine long used and little loved. "Was it posted locally?" Purbright asked. "The postmark says so," she replied, lifting her handkerchief with faint theatricality. "And to think, Inspector, I've supported the postal service for years." He turned the envelope over, noting the slightly greasy fingerprint smudged across one corner. "Did anyone know you'd spoken to me?" "I haven't told a soul," she said too quickly. "Well, perhaps I mentioned it to Mr. Liversedge when he called about his umbrella. And Mrs. Withens did ring to commiserate, and then the paper telephoned. How they got my number I cannot imagine." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. He pocketed the letter with care, then studied her expression. "You say your husband brought the specimen from Egypt?" "Yes. At least that was his story. I never much cared for such things. He kept it in a cabinet with several jars and, oh, a ghastly mask. When he died, I disposed of most of it. Gave some to the museum in Brummage. They sent a receipt, most businesslike. But the hand, well, I suppose I thought it sentimental." "Did he ever mention where it came from, specifically?" She hesitated, as if consulting a memory she preferred not to handle. "There was a lady, an acquaintance from his time abroad. Mrs. Latimer, I think. She collected relics, and my husband admired her energy. That was all long ago, of course. Purbright thanked her gently, but as he left, his eyes rested on a framed photograph above the mantel. A much younger Mrs. Clayforth stood beside a man in evening dress, his expression sleek with satisfaction. In the background, half out of focus, was another woman, handsome, dark-haired, and smiling directly at the camera. Beneath the frame, a small brass plate read, "Cairo, 1938. Outside, the drizzle had thickened to a mist that blurred the lamplight. Purbright walked slowly back toward the station, his thoughts pacing at the same deliberate speed. By mid-afternoon, he had traced the name Latimer through an old correspondence file kept by the museum in Bromwich. Mrs. Margaret Latimer, formerly of Cairo, had died in 1946, leaving an unindexed collection of minor antiquities, most of which had been dispersed through auction. One of those auctions, held in London the following year, had been attended by, Purbright smiled faintly, Captain Reginald Clayforth. The catalogue description for Lot 93 read, "Mummified human hand, female with fragment of textile wrapping, Egyptian, provenance uncertain." So the relic was genuine enough in origin, if not in intention. But then, why had it reappeared, decades later, so theatrically? That question was interrupted by Sergeant Malley, who entered with the embarrassed briskness of a man who knows he is bearing gossip. "Message from the morgue, sir. They've had another look at that hand. Seems it isn't Egyptian after all." Purbright regarded him mildly. "No?" "No, sir. The bone structure's European, female, middle-aged. Not embalmed, not ancient. They reckon maybe 50 years old. Whoever wrapped it up must have known enough to fake the rest." Purbright's expression did not change, but the pause that followed seemed to gather weight. 50 years, he said softly. That would place its owner among the living memories of some of our older inhabitants. He rose and reached for his coat. "Let's take a little drive, Sergeant. I think our hand has touched Flaxborough before." Their first stop was the churchyard. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle that seemed content to rest on the gravestones rather than fall. Purbright led the way toward the older section, where inscriptions blurred into moss. Near the east wall stood a stone, tilted slightly, inscribed Margaret Latimer, 1898-1939, beloved wife of Edwin. Purbright regarded it for a long moment, then tapped the stone with the handle of his umbrella. "Odd, don't you think that our Cairo acquaintance should rest here?" Malley blinked. "You mean she's buried in Flaxborough?" "So it appears. And yet Mrs. Clayforth told us her friend was alive when her husband returned with the hand. Curious timing." He stooped, examining the grass at the base of the headstone. The soil was darker, freshly turned in a narrow line as though by a small animal, or a recent visitor's stick. They walked back toward the car. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and, somewhere near the vicarage wall, new paint. Purbright stopped. "I think," he said, "we shall speak again with our diligent verger. I've always found that men who polish metal too often are sometimes polishing their consciences." He looked up at the lowering sky, and his smile, small, private, and rather weary, returned. A European hand, wrapped in hospital linen, sealed with wax from a church candle, and presented for public admiration. It has a sermon in it, Malley. The question is, who wrote the text? Inspector Purbright's remark about sermons proved prophetic. The next day, Sunday, found St. Michael's unusually full for morning service, a circumstance owing less to spiritual fervour than to curiosity. The flower show's relic, as it was already called, had given Flaxborough a whiff of Gothic excitement, and many who had not crossed the church threshold in years appeared with hymn books borrowed from neighbours. The vicar, the Reverend Swinford, aware that speculation now outran devotion, had prepared a sermon on the misuse of sacred curiosity. It struck a tone of cautious indignation, describing those who toy with relics or symbols as inviting the devil to a garden party. Purbright, seated at the rear beside Sergeant Malley, listened with polite serenity, his gaze wandering from the pulpit to the congregation. It was less the words that interested him than the ripples they produced. Mrs. Clayforth dabbed discreetly at her eyes, while Mrs. Withens maintained the fixed moral posture of a woman vindicated. Mr. Cribb, the verger, stood near the font with his usual proprietary gloom. Only Councillor Harcourt, 2 pews ahead, seemed restless, turning the pages of his hymn book as though searching for an escape clause. After the final hymn, Purbright lingered in the porch, exchanging mild greetings as parishioners passed. The air was fragrant with damp wool and moral relief. When Cribb appeared, carrying the offertory plate like a man burdened by too much honesty, Purbright stopped him with a question so gentle that it seemed almost an afterthought. "Tell me, Mr. Cribb, when you cleaned the brass in the chancel last week, did you notice any wax missing from the candle stands?" Cribb blinked. "Wax, sir? Oh, there's always wax. Never quite where you'd wish it, mind. I scrape it regular." "Indeed? And what do you do with it?" "Why, bin it, of course." "No use for bits of candle." Purbright smiled. "Quite so. Yet I imagine, for a man of thrifty habits, the temptation to remold a few pieces might arise." Cribb flushed faintly. "I'm no candle maker, Inspector." "No, but you are a man who dislikes waste. And wax," Purbright added softly, "leaves a trace that can be very revealing." He let the silence hover, then offered a courteous nod and walked away, leaving the verger's face a study in uncertain virtue. That afternoon, Purbright visited the church again, officially to consult the vicar about the timing of a parish inventory, unofficially to observe the building when empty. The nave was cool and echoing, filled with the faint scent of polish and lilies. In the corner, a broom rested against the display case, now properly locked and conspicuously empty. He examined the case with quiet care. On the inner rim of the lid's brass latch, invisible from outside, clung a minute fragment of white wax. He replaced the lid gently and stood back, the faintest smile touching his lips. Then he knelt by the base of the case and noted something else, a smear of grayish dust, not from the stone floor but finer, almost powdery. Hospital talc, perhaps, or the residue of sterilized fabric. When he straightened, the vicar was watching him from the vestry doorway. "You find our old exhibits exciting, Inspector?" "Educational, certainly," said Purbright. "They show how history accumulates, often without permission." Swinford frowned. "I do hope this business won't encourage more, donations. Mrs. Withens is talking of starting a collection for proper display lighting." Purbright thanked him and left, walking slowly through the drizzle toward the high street. He stopped only once, at the ironmonger's, where he purchased a small box of candles. Back at the station, he lit one on his desk, allowing a thin trickle of wax to fall upon a scrap of the same linen that had wrapped the hand. As it cooled, he pressed it gently with his thumb, observing the pale, greasy sheen. "You see, Malley," he murmured, "church wax has a modest constitution. It never truly hardens. Candlelight has memory." Malley, whose imagination lagged respectfully behind his superior's metaphors, frowned. "So someone used church candles to seal the wrapping. That narrows it to the verger, the vicar, or the altar guild." "Perhaps," said Purbright. "But remember, wax is communal, linen less so. Whoever wrapped that hand chose material borrowed from the hospital, a curious blend of the sacred and the hygienic. An attempt, I think, to make the unclean appear clinical." He snuffed the candle and sat back. "I'd like to know whether St. Luke's has ever had cause to dispose of anatomical parts. A hand, for instance." Malley looked alarmed. "You think it's from the hospital, sir?" "I think it passed that way," said Purbright. Hospitals, like churches, are full of things no one wants to acknowledge, but no one dares throw away. By evening, he had arranged a discreet visit to St. Luke's after hours. The matron, when approached again, maintained her formidable dignity, but agreed to show the inspector the storeroom. The hospital's older wing was dimly lit and smelled faintly of carbolic. Rows of cupboards lined the walls, each marked in faded ink. When one drawer was pulled open, a drift of paper labels stirred like old moths. Purbright examined them quietly. Specimen, appendix, gall bladder, historical, unclaimed remains. Most bore dates from before the war. "I see your predecessors were reluctant to part with anything," he said mildly. Matron Pendry sniffed. "Medical science is a frugal discipline." "Quite so." He closed a drawer, then added, "You've had new staff recently, I believe." She hesitated. "Only a temporary porter. Came through the agency, James something. Very willing, if a little too talkative. Left last week. Said his mother was ill." "Do you recall his address?" Her lips tightened. "No, but the agency would." As they left, Purbright paused by the window. Through the misted pane he could see the church spire, faint and pale against the dusk. "How close the town keeps its institutions," he remarked. "The body and the soul never quite separate." Later, as he wrote his notes in tidy, deliberate script, a thought settled like a quiet bell tone in his mind. 50 years old. European. Female. A hand, wrapped to appear foreign, found where gossip was guaranteed, handled by those eager to seem respectable. It was not superstition that had placed it there. It was theatre, and theatre always has a playwright. He looked up from the paper. "Mally," he said softly, "find out if any woman of that age disappeared, or died oddly, in Flaxborough around 1939. I've a feeling she's come home for the last time." By Monday afternoon, the drizzle had thinned to a reluctant mist that clung to the roofs as though uncertain of its purpose. Inside the police station, the air was warm and thick with the faint smell of typewriter ribbon and wet coats. Sergeant Mally entered with a sheaf of notes held as carefully as if they were fragile china. "Found something, sir," he said, a note of reluctant excitement in his voice. "Checked through the old coroner's records from 39 and 40. There's an entry for a Mrs. Margaret Latimer, same name as on that gravestone. Official cause of death, accidental drowning in the river near the lock. But there's a notation here, body recovered incomplete." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Incomplete?" "Yes, sir. Missing the right hand. The rest was identified by a brooch and dental records." The inspector's chair creaked as he leaned back. "So our Egyptian relic may have been British after all. Rather more local than anyone imagined." Mally shuffled his papers. "There's more. The investigating officer at the time was Inspector Beaufield. Retired 20 years ago, lives out at Thimble End." Purbright regarded the rain-spattered window for a moment, then rose. "Let's go and renew his acquaintance with the past." Baufield's cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane bordered by hedgerows that appeared to have been trimmed last during the reign of Edward VII. The man himself, stooped but alert, opened the door in his shirt sleeves. His eyes, small and pale, regarded the visitors with mild curiosity. "Flaxborough Police, is it? Don't tell me I've left my pension behind." Purbright smiled. "Not quite. We've been revisiting a case you once handled. Mrs. Margaret Latimer, 1939. Beaufield's brow furrowed. "Ah, that one. The woman in the river. Tricky business. They said she fell in during a walk. I never liked it. Too tidy." "You thought there was more to it?" Beaufield nodded slowly, motioning them inside. The sitting room smelled of old tobacco and beeswax. She'd been staying with friends. Clayforth, wasn't it? Captain and Mrs. Clayforth. Nice enough people, but the sort who tidy away unpleasantness. I remember the husband being very firm that she'd been depressed. There'd been a row about something. He wouldn't say what. Then she vanishes, and 2 days later she's pulled from the lock. Missing a hand, yes, but that's not so strange in water. I made my report, but there was pressure to call it accidental. War was starting. Nobody wanted scandals. Purbright's voice was mild. And you accepted it? Not gladly, Beaufield admitted. But there was no proof. No one saw her fall, no sign of violence. The coroner was a friend of Clayforth's. I kept the file longer than I should have, hoping for something. The old man looked toward the hearth, where the fire's glow softened his lined features. I always wondered what became of that missing hand. When they left the cottage, twilight had settled in, the air thick with the smell of damp leaves. Purbright walked slowly to the car, saying nothing. Mally waited until they were halfway back to town before asking, "You think Clayforth killed her, sir?" "I think," said Purbright, "that the hand was the one piece of her that refused to sink quietly. Someone kept it, perhaps as a souvenir, perhaps as insurance. And now, 50 years later, it's been returned to us. The dead are rarely so patient without help." That night, Purbright reread the Clayforth file in the station's records room. The captain's statement was brief and bland. His wife's guest had taken a solitary walk by the river. She was melancholic. It was all terribly sad. The handwriting, neat but firm, betrayed no tremor. A small note in the margin, perhaps Beaufield's, read, "Neighbor heard quarrel about papers the night before disappearance." Papers. The word hovered in Purbright's mind like a mote in sunlight. The next morning, he returned to Fenwick Lane. Mrs. Clayforth, though visibly startled, received him with a kind of weary grace. "I'm afraid I've no more to tell you, Inspector," she said, gesturing toward the sitting room. "This business has quite ruined my nerves." Purbright glanced at the mantel where the photograph still stood. Mrs. Clayforth, her husband, and the dark-haired woman smiling from the background. "A charming picture," he said softly. "Mrs. Latimer looks most at ease." She hesitated. "You know her name, then?" "It's my trade to know a little more each day," Purbright replied. "Tell me, madam, why was she buried here in Flaxborough?" Her composure wavered. "Reggie, Captain Clayforth, insisted. He said she had no family left, and he thought it right. I hardly knew what to do." "Quite so. And after his death, you decided to keep the souvenir." Her face went rigid. "Souvenir?" "The hand," Purbright said gently. "It was not his from Egypt, was it?" "It was hers, the woman in the photograph." He brought it back, perhaps in panic, perhaps in guilt. "You kept it because to destroy it would be to admit what you knew." Her voice, when it came, was brittle. "That's a monstrous suggestion." "Monstrous," Purbright agreed, "and yet the hand has reappeared, wrapped carefully, sealed with wax, placed where gossip would flourish. That doesn't happen by accident." For a long time she said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, measuring her silence. At last she whispered, "I didn't place it there. I swear I didn't. I wanted it gone. I gave it to Mr. Liversedge to dispose of. I thought he'd take it to the museum." Purbright studied her face, which bore the pallor of long exhaustion. "And instead, it was displayed at the flower show. How unfortunate that the dead never quite stay where we put them." When he left, dusk had fallen again. The air held that peculiar stillness which Flaxborough knew before another scandal ripened. As Purbright walked toward the station, his thoughts arranged themselves quietly. Someone else had known the truth. Someone close enough to the Clayforths to sense what had been hidden and to find that hidden thing. But unlike the Clayforths, that person had no interest in concealing the past. He reached the station door and paused. "Mally," he said as the sergeant looked up from his desk, "ask the Historical Society to lend us their membership list. I have a feeling history has been doing a little editing of its own." The Historical Society met that evening in the reading room above the library, a faintly musty chamber with high windows and the resigned odour of old bindings. Inspector Purbright arrived just as Ambrose Liversedge, looking thinner and more harassed than usual, was adjusting a slide projector that wheezed like a reluctant kettle. The audience consisted of the customary dozen: retired teachers, amateur genealogists, and one man who attended chiefly to nap discreetly under the pretense of note-taking. Purbright, slipping quietly into a seat at the back, drew little notice. His presence was easily mistaken for that of another mild enthusiast for parish trivia. Liversedge began his talk, a dutiful account of local curiosities and their preservation, but his voice betrayed distraction. Each slide, a tarnished key, a faded map, appeared to weary him. When, midway through the lecture, the image of the church display case filled the screen, there was a stir among the audience. Someone whispered, "That's where they found it." Liversedge cleared his throat and clicked hurriedly to the next slide, a medieval shoe buckle, as though to outrun the subject. Afterwards, Purbright lingered while the others shuffled out. When the room was nearly empty, he approached. "An instructive talk, Mr. Liversedge. I'm glad you touched on the importance of provenance, though it must be vexing when an item's history becomes rather livelier than expected." The scholar's hand trembled as he gathered his papers. "I told you everything, Inspector. I only meant to deliver the parcel as Mrs. Clayforth asked." "Indeed. And you did?" "To the market hall, yes, where it briefly vanished. I locked it away, same as always. Ask Brant, the caretaker. I never opened it." Purbright nodded mildly. "No doubt, but someone did. And whoever did knew exactly what was inside and exactly what story it would tell once displayed. Tell me, Mr. Liversedge, did you mention to anyone that the package came from Mrs. Clayforth?" Liversedge hesitated. "Only to Councillor Harcourt. He was at the Sap Hall, overseeing the arrangements for the show. He asked about the parcel. I thought he had authority." "Ah," said Purbright softly. "Councillor Harcourt, a man of authority and a connoisseur of information. Thank you." He left the library with the faintest smile, as though a puzzle piece had quietly clicked into place. The following morning, Purbright requested Sergeant Mallet to look into Harcourt's background. Not the public version, what the town prefers not to print. By noon, Mallet returned, cheeks flushed with the satisfaction of a well-executed rummage. "Harcourt's had money troubles for years," he reported. "Property deals gone wrong. The council keeps him afloat because he knows where too many of them have mislaid things. Receipts, mostly. And there's more. His late aunt was nurse at St. Luke's Hospital. Matron Pendry confirmed it. She died 3 months ago. Lived in those old hospital cottages near the church." Purbright's expression did not change, but his gaze sharpened slightly. "So our councillor may have inherited more than debts. A nurse's effects might include spare linen or other curiosities." He rose and adjusted his hat. "Let's go and see how civic conscience manages its accounts." They found Harcourt at home, a broad, complacent man whose self-importance had settled like lard. His house on Bingham Crescent was neat but joyless, furnished as though with an eye to resale. He greeted Purbright with the wary cheerfulness of someone who suspects the visit concerns overdue taxes. "Inspector, what brings you to my humble abode? Not another inquiry about that ridiculous mummy business, I hope?" Purbright smiled gently. "Just tying up a few threads. You were at the market hall when Mr. Liversedge delivered Mrs. Clayforth's parcel, I believe." "Quite right. I was supervising the horticultural entries. Everything above board." "Of course. And yet you took an interest in a parcel that wasn't your concern." Harcourt shrugged. "Purely curiosity. I'd been told there was a valuable relic involved. Thought it might attract visitors." "Visitors?" Purbright repeated. "Yes, I imagine scandal does wonders for attendance. You wouldn't happen to know who unlocked the steward's cupboard that afternoon?" "I? Certainly not. I left early for a committee meeting." Purbright regarded him with patient calm. Counsellor, you were seen unlocking it. Mr. Cribb, the verger, recalls you borrowing his key. You told him the mayor's wife had misplaced hers. A flicker crossed Harcourt's face. Annoyance first, then calculation. Well, I might have. There was confusion, but I didn't open any parcel, Inspector. Then perhaps you can tell me how fragments of candle wax from St. Michael's came to be on your jacket sleeve that day. Harcourt blinked. Wax? Really, Inspector, you can't expect me to remember every bit of fluff. Purbright's tone remained courteous. No, but I remember you've been quite energetic in promoting the Historical Society's funding proposal. A pity the scandal you arranged to excite local interest has revived an older story instead. The death of Mrs. Margaret Latimer. For a moment, Harcourt's mouth worked without sound. Then he laughed, a dry, mirthless bark. You can't prove a thing. I didn't kill anyone. I never said you did, Purbright replied softly. I believe you discovered something that others preferred forgotten. Perhaps your late aunt's papers, old hospital notes, maybe even the specimen itself, kept as a curiosity from that unfortunate drowning. You saw an opportunity, a touch of the exotic to draw attention to your cultural cause. And when the press called it a mummy's hand, you let them. Harcourt's face reddened. It was harmless. I meant no harm, just a bit of showmanship. Yes, said Purbright, but it wasn't harmless. You turned a woman's death into entertainment, and in doing so disturbed a secret others had carefully buried. You made people remember, Counsellor, and memory, I've found, is the most dangerous relic of all. He left Harcourt, sitting amid his expensive emptiness, staring at nothing. Outside, the afternoon sun broke weakly through the haze. Purbright paused, drawing a slow breath of the river-scented air. You see, Mally, he said, our counsellor may not have committed a crime, but he's guilty of something much older. Vanity dressed as virtue. The past rarely forgives that sort of presumption. They walked back toward the station, their footsteps quiet on the damp pavement. The case, Purbright thought, was almost complete, though one question still lingered like a faint odor of candle smoke. Who, after all these years, had first unearthed the hand and set it on its final journey? Someone had guided it from the forgotten drawer to the church display case, not for spectacle, but for justice, and that, he suspected, was a subtler mind than Counsellor Harcourt's. He looked up at the distant church spire, where a single gull wheeled against the grey. The dead have their advocates too, he murmured. We must find ours. The following day dawned with a damp wind off the river and a sky the colour of old pewter. Flaxborough, having exhausted the more lurid versions of the mummy affair, was drifting back toward its habitual preoccupation with the price of milk and the mayor's hat. Yet for Inspector Purbright, the matter had begun to settle in that half-lit stage between completion and unease, the point where one loose thread, stubbornly untugged, begins to whisper. Counsellor Harcourt, though properly chastened, had proved pitifully small in the role of puppet master. His confession, such as it was, had the thin sincerity of someone frightened less by guilt than by exposure. What lingered with Purbright was the precision of the act itself, the hand's careful wrapping, its deliberate placement among the relics, the choice of setting where scandal would blossom under the cover of civic respectability. Vanity could prompt foolishness, but this had been art. He sat at his desk, eyes half closed, listening to the faint tick of the clock and the rain fingering the window. Mally came in with 2 cups of tea and a look of quiet triumph. Got the hospital agency's records, sir. That temporary porter, the one matron mentioned, James Lister, came from Grantham, left after a fortnight, address unknown. Purbright opened his eyes. Lister? That surname has a faintly medical ring to it, doesn't it? Dissection and all that. Mally smiled uncertainly. We can check with Grantham Police. Yes, but I doubt Mr. Lister exists outside the register of invention. I rather think someone borrowed his name for convenience, someone who knew both St. Luke's and the church rather well. You mean Cribb, sir? Purbright stirred his tea. Possibly. He's always hovering between the sacred and the secular, and he strikes me as the kind of man who believes sin should be polished out with elbow grease. An hour later, they found the verger in the churchyard, stooped over a patch of gravel with a broom whose bristles had long since lost hope. When Purbright greeted him, he straightened, eyes wary. "Morning, Mr. Cribb. Keeping the Lord's acre tidy?" "As tidy as people let it, Inspector. Sunday lot leave toffee papers among the headstones. No reverence these days." "Quite so," said Purbright. "Though it's interesting, isn't it, how the dead tend to return tidier than the living ever manage?" Cribb's hand tightened on the broom handle. "You've been talking to that gossip of a matron, I reckon." "Indeed. She spoke well of your industriousness, and of the hospital linen you borrowed. You were right, it does polish brass admirably. But I can't help wondering whether it also wraps other things as neatly." Cribb's lips moved, but no sound came. Purbright's tone remained gentle. "The hand, Mr. Cribb. It wasn't Harcourt who placed it in the case, was it? He was too fond of noise, too clumsy. You, on the other hand, had the key, the access, and, more important, the conviction that something long overlooked required proper attention." For a moment, only the wind answered, stirring the cypress branches overhead. Then Cribb spoke, his voice dry and thin. "You think I dug her up, after all these years?" "Not quite. I think you found what had never truly been buried. You've been verger here for, 25 years. You'd have taken over from old Jenkins, who kept the sexton's ledger in that iron cabinet behind the vestry. It lists every interment, every reburial, and I suspect, if we were to look closely, we'd find a curious note about a parcel transferred from hospital to church storage shortly before your tenure began." Cribb's mouth twitched. "The ledger's private. Of course, as private as guilt ever is." The broom slipped from his grasp. "She was my aunt," he said suddenly, voice breaking into a brittle whisper. "Margaret Latimer. They said she drowned, but I knew better. I was a boy, but I remember the talk, how Captain Clayforth came back from the river, white as a shroud, how they buried her quick, quiet, like shame. When I came to work at St. Luke's years later, I found a specimen jar with a hand inside and her initials scratched on the lid. Nobody else noticed. I couldn't bear it lying there among gallbladders and gallstones. So I took it." Purbright listened without interruption. The rain had ceased, leaving the air sharp and still. "I thought," Cribb went on, "if people saw it, they'd have to ask. They'd have to remember. Not the fancy Egypt rubbish, not the jokes, just the truth that she'd been wronged. Maybe even by that Mrs. Clayforth. They were friends once, until the captain looked twice where he shouldn't. I meant it as a reminder, that's all." "A reminder wrapped like a relic," said Purbright softly. "You chose the church because confession is safer than accusation." Cribb gave a small, humorless laugh. "Did it work?" Purbright looked at him with weary compassion. "It worked enough to unsettle the living, but the dead, I'm afraid, are harder to serve." Cribb nodded faintly. "Then I'll not trouble her again. There's peace in knowing someone noticed." Purbright inclined his head, a gesture that might have been approval or sorrow. "Return the ledger to the vestry. I'll say nothing beyond what decency requires." He turned away, letting the man's figure fade into the greyness of the churchyard. The stones, darkened by rain, seemed to press inward, their inscriptions half swallowed by moss. Somewhere nearby, a bell struck the hour, with an almost human weariness. As he walked back to the station, Purbright reflected on the curious symmetry of it all. Vanity had uncovered what conscience had unearthed. In Flaxborough, the past never stayed decently dead. It merely waited, patient and muffled, for someone with the nerve, or the need, to lift the cloth. And when that someone did, it was never malice that set the scene in motion, but the ordinary ache of remembrance. He reached the corner where the church spire disappeared behind the row of shops and paused, lighting a cigarette with the careful air of a man who knew he would not be thanked for being right. The smoke drifted upward, curling against the fading clouds. "Justice," he murmured, "has the oddest ways of making itself heard." Then, with his usual calm tread, he turned toward the police station, where the paperwork waited. Silent, inevitable, and as unremarkable as the town that had, once again, quietly revealed its sins. Evening crept into Flaxborough like an afterthought, the kind of dusk that softened roofs and blurred intentions. Inspector Purbright lingered by his office window long after the last constable had gone home. Below him, the street lamps trembled into life, and the faint glow of shop signs smeared the wet cobblestones with streaks of color. He drew slowly on his cigarette, letting the smoke coil upward, and considered the day's peculiar symmetry. The guilty, the blameless, and those who managed to occupy both categories without discomfort. The verger's confession had, in its own small way, completed the circle. Mrs. Clayforth's relic, Harcourt's vanity, Liversedge's nervous compliance, all were merely tributaries feeding the same quiet stream of provincial deception. The difference lay in motive. Harcourt had acted from pride, Cribb from conscience, Mrs. Clayforth from fear. Each, in their own fashion, had disturbed the sediment of the past. And yet something still eluded him, something that hummed beneath the story like a faint, unending note. He stubbed out the cigarette, crossed to his desk, and opened his notebook. The page looked orderly enough, names, dates, arrows connecting causes and consequences, but the satisfaction of conclusion refused to settle. It was as though the case had closed itself too neatly, as if some invisible hand had tidied away the last detail before he could reach for it. The telephone rang with a sound too sharp for the hour. Purbright lifted the receiver. It was Sergeant Malley, his voice low and uncertain. "Sir, we've had a call from Mrs. Withens. She says someone's been in the church again." Purbright's tone did not change. "Again?" "Yes, sir. She found the vestry door open. The ledger's missing." There was the briefest pause before Purbright answered. "I see. Tell Mrs. Withens not to tidy anything until we arrive." The church, when they reached it, stood solemn and black against the dim outline of the cemetery. Inside, the faint scent of polish and candle wax lingered, mingled now with something colder. Damp air and unease. The vestry door hung slightly ajar. Purbright's torch beam moved across the floor, revealing scuffed marks near the cabinet where Cribb kept his tools and records. The old ledger, whose existence he had only guessed at, was indeed gone. "Someone wanted to erase the last trace of that woman's death," Malley said quietly. "Or to protect it," Purbright replied. His light paused on a small object half hidden beneath a chair leg, a silver button, dull with age. He pocketed it without comment. They stepped outside again, where the night had turned heavier, the mist thick as breath. From across the churchyard came a sound, soft, uncertain, then suddenly distinct, the slam of a gate. Purbright moved toward it, his pace unhurried but certain. Near the east wall, a figure hesitated in the lamplight, half shadow, half remorse. "Mr. Cribb," Purbright said. "That ledger was safer here than in your conscience." The verger turned slowly, his face drawn and pale. "I couldn't let it sit there, Inspector, not after what I told you. If they saw it, if the papers got hold of it, she'd be made a spectacle all over again. I wanted it finished." "By burning it?" Cribb's hand trembled, clutching the ledger to his chest. "She's been gossiped about once already." "I won't let them do it again." Purbright's voice softened. "The truth doesn't vanish with ash, Mr. Cribb. It only drifts until it finds another crack to settle in. Give it here." For a moment, the man's grip tightened, then slackened. He handed over the book like a child surrendering contraband. "You'll lock it away?" "I'll file it," Purbright said, which is much the same thing, only less poetic. Cribb nodded once, his eyes glistening. "You were right, Inspector. It wasn't her peace I disturbed. It was my own." When he had gone, Purbright stood alone among the gravestones, the ledger tucked under his arm. The rain began again, soft and steady. He looked down at the damp earth that covered Margaret Latimer's resting place. "It seems," he murmured, "that even the most dutiful of men can't resist rewriting scripture when grief holds the pen." By the next morning, Cribb had vanished. His lodgings were found neatly ordered. The broom hung precisely in its place. On the kitchen table lay a note in an unsteady hand. "She is at rest now. Please see that I'm not far away." Purbright read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the file beside the ledger. No search party was organized. The river, he knew, would yield its stories soon enough. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Clayforth telephoned. Her voice trembled between relief and apprehension. "Inspector, I saw the paper. They said it's all concluded. That poor man, the verger. Terrible, really. But it means the matter's done with, doesn't it?" "It means," said Purbright gently, "that one part of it has been laid to rest. Whether the rest follows is a question for time." He replaced the receiver and looked out at the square, where children splashed in puddles as though no history had ever troubled their small town. Malley entered a few minutes later, hat in hand. "It's strange, sir. All that fuss over an old story, and in the end, the only crime was caring too much." Purbright smiled faintly. "Flaxborough's crimes are nearly always emotional ones, Sergeant. They simply disguise themselves as tidiness." He opened the desk drawer and took out the button he'd found in the vestry. On its surface was a faint engraving, the initials Heba M.L., entwined with a tiny serpent motif. It might once have adorned a woman's cuff or a gentleman's coat. He turned it over in his fingers, studying the way the light caught in its grooves. "Some details," he said softly, "prefer to remain forgotten. Others insist on being noticed, like the flicker of a candle in a locked church." Malley looked puzzled, but did not interrupt. Purbright slipped the button into an envelope and added it to the growing file marked "The Mummy's Final Secret." Outside, the rain eased. The sound of the town resumed its modest rhythm. The clatter of teacups, the rattle of a bus, the faint laughter of shoppers. To anyone passing, the police station appeared as dull and self-contained as ever, its inspector a figure of unremarkable calm. But behind the window, as twilight returned, Purbright sat very still, staring at the closed file, his thoughts turning once more to that lonely hand and to the strange small town that had held its secret for half a century. Somewhere, beyond reach of his reasoning, he sensed that the past had not quite finished speaking. The days that followed moved with a muffled rhythm peculiar to Flaxborough after a scandal. Conversations that began with sympathy drifted inevitably into speculation, and every expression of regret was followed by a sigh of faint satisfaction. The verger's death, confirmed 2 mornings later when a body was found caught in the reeds by the lock, provided the town with a melancholy conclusion that most found tidy enough for comfort. Mrs. Withens had already spoken of arranging a small memorial tea. For decency's sake, Mrs. Bullimore, with the mayor's authority and her own sense of civic theatre, promised to attend. For Inspector Purbright, however, the affair refused to close neatly. He had written his report with the same calm thoroughness that characterized all his paperwork, yet each line felt like a compromise between truth and mercy. The coroner would call it suicide, grief, guilt, or perhaps religious mania. The newspapers, mercifully dulled by repetition, would print something short and decorous, and the file, once placed in the station's archive, would yellow into quiet forgetfulness. But the small button with the serpent engraving still lay on his desk, gleaming faintly even in the weak light of late afternoon, and Purbright found his gaze returning to it with an unease he could not quite dismiss. He turned it over once more, studying the faint initials, M.L., and thought of Margaret Latimer's grave beneath the sodden yew trees. The motif of the serpent seemed oddly elaborate for the modest woman described in old parish records. It spoke of vanity or of some older emblem, a token, perhaps, rather than a mere ornament. He slipped the button into his pocket and reached for his hat. The churchyard was empty when he arrived, the air still carrying the dull scent of rain and river water. He walked slowly to the east wall, where moss clung thickly to the stones. The grave was easy to find, its inscription worn smoother than memory. Someone, perhaps Cribb before his final walk to the loch, had placed a sprig of rosemary there. Purbright stood for a long while, listening to the quiet drip of water from the branches. Then he noticed something that had escaped his earlier visits. The headstone leaned slightly forward, not from age, but from a recent disturbance in the soil around its base. The grass was uneven, flattened in places where footsteps had pressed. He crouched, brushing away a thin crust of earth. The soil was darker beneath, newly turned. A few inches down, his fingers touched something cold and metallic. When he lifted it, the light caught a tarnished clasp. Its design matched the button precisely. It might once have belonged to a bracelet or a locket fastening. For a long moment, Purbright remained still, holding the clasp in his palm. Then he straightened, the faintest sigh escaping him. "So," he murmured, "the past still wants its say." He walked back to the vicarage, where Reverend Swinford answered the door with the weary composure of a man who sensed that his peace was again about to be disturbed. Purbright showed him the clasp without preamble. "Tell me, Reverend," he said quietly, "has this church ever suffered from grave tampering?" Swinford frowned. "Good heavens, no. We've had thefts from the flower fund, perhaps, but never that." "What are you implying?" "Only that someone has been visiting Mrs. Latimer's grave rather more intimately than flowers require." The vicar's face blanched. "That's dreadful." "Surely not." Purbright's tone was calm, almost conversational. "It may not be as dreadful as it sounds. I think Mr. Cribb paid a final call here before his death. He may have been trying to return what he once took. Or perhaps—" He hesitated, gazing past the vicar to the rain-darkened hallway. Perhaps he wasn't alone. Swinford swallowed. "You mean someone helped him?" "Helped or hindered? It's hard to say. He was a solitary man, but solitaries often attract the company of the curious. Tell me, has anyone else shown sudden interest in that grave?" The vicar hesitated, then said reluctantly, "Mrs. Withens came to see me yesterday. She said she'd been tending the older plots, for tidiness, as she put it. But now that you ask, yes, she did mention seeing Cribb there one evening last week. She thought he was praying." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Withens is a capable woman. Efficient, I think, would be the word." "She means well," said Swinford, though his tone lacked conviction. "That's often where the trouble begins," Purbright murmured. He thanked the vicar, pocketed the clasp, and returned to the station, his thoughts moving with deliberate precision. The verger's remorse explained much, but the ledger's disappearance and the disturbed grave suggested a second hand at work, a guiding, tidying influence. Someone had ensured that the story ended neatly, that guilt was expiated, and the town could fold its napkins with relief. Someone, perhaps, who understood that reputations in Flaxborough required pruning like hedges. When dusk fell, Purbright walked to the Withens' residence, a narrow, respectable house with curtains drawn as tightly as its owner's lips. She answered at once, her expression hovering between outrage and anticipation. "Inspector, if this is about that unfortunate man, I must tell you, he was unbalanced. I always said so. Morbid." Purbright removed his hat. Morbid, perhaps, but not foolish. I believe he came to you before the end. Her mouth tightened. Nonsense. I'd nothing to do with his peculiar fancies. He met her eyes evenly. Then how do you explain this? He placed the clasp on her hall table. It matches a button found in the vestry. Both bear Mrs. Latimer's initials. You were in the church the day before Cribb disappeared. You told Mrs. Pendry you were arranging flowers. And yet, the flowers in question have no business being placed by the east wall. For the first time, Mrs. Withens faltered. He asked me, she whispered. He wanted it returned. Said she deserved her hand back. I thought, well, it was sentimental, but it seemed harmless. He said it would give him peace. And so you went with him. She nodded slowly. I thought he was going to bury it quietly, but when he began digging, he grew strange, talking about her eyes watching him, about how she'd forgive him only if she was made whole again. I grew frightened and left him there. I didn't tell anyone. Purbright regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You helped him do what conscience demanded, Mrs. Withens, and then you left him to what conscience does best. He turned to go. At the door he paused. You needn't fear prosecution. I imagine Flaxborough prefers its penitence conducted in private. When she closed the door, he stood a moment in the street, the lamplight falling weakly across the damp pavement. The wind carried a faint smell of the river. The case had reached its end, not by design, but by the slow, inevitable settling of human frailty. The dead woman, the guilty, the devout, all at last arranged in the proper moral geometry of the town. Purbright drew his collar up against the wind and walked back toward the station, where the single light still burned above his desk, steady and patient as ever. Morning came pale and unhurried, the sort of morning Flaxborough favored when it wanted to forget things. The puddles had lost their reflections, the air smelled faintly of soot and bread, and the town's talk, after its brief flirtation with mystery, had returned to more comfortable topics. The council's new parking regulations, the disappearance of the butcher's apprentice, and whether Mrs. Bullamore's hat at the memorial tea had truly been imported from Cheltenham. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat at his desk beneath the same unassuming lamp that had watched him through every stage of the investigation. Before him lay the finished file, the mummy's final secret, now heavy with notes, statements, and photographs. On top, the silver button gleamed faintly, its serpent engraving dulled by a thin film of dust. He turned the button between his fingers, then replaced it in its envelope. Outside, the station's clock struck 9. Brisk, punctual, slightly self-important, much like the town it served. Sergeant Malley entered carrying 2 cups of tea, his face brighter than the weather deserved. All quiet, sir, he reported. No more visitors to the church. Mrs. Withens is off to stay with her sister in Grantham. The vicar's sermon yesterday was on forgiveness. Appropriate, said Purbright mildly, though premature. Malley hesitated. You think there's more to it? Purbright looked up, his eyes thoughtful but kind. There's always more to it, Sergeant, but what remains seldom requires our interference. He gestured toward the file. This, what we call a case, wasn't about crime in the usual sense. It was about what people do with guilt once it loses its owner. The past, when ignored, tends to hire new servants. Malley considered this, frowned slightly, and took a sip of tea. Still, I can't help feeling sorry for the verger. He wasn't a bad man. No, Purbright said softly. He was the best sort of wrong one, conscientious. His only mistake was believing that the dead need help to speak. They rarely do. He reached for the final report, signing it with neat precision. When he had finished, he closed the file and leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the market square. Across the street, the window of the fatted calf glowed invitingly, promising warmth and the particular consolation of gossip retold as history. Malley followed his gaze. You'll be glad to have it over, sir. Odd business, all told. Egyptian curses, old scandals, missing hands. Purbright smiled faintly. There were never any curses, Sergeant. Just people who wanted the world to remember them kindly and were willing to confuse remembrance with resurrection. A knock sounded at the office door. The constable from the desk appeared, cap in hand. "Message from the post, sir. This came for you." He handed Purbright a small envelope, plain, unmarked. The inspector opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph, the churchyard, taken from a low angle. At the center, Margaret Latimer's headstone stood upright once more, its lettering cleaned, the soil at its base smoothed and leveled. There was no note, no signature. Purbright studied the image for a moment, then smiled. Not with surprise, but with a recognition of inevitability. "Someone," he said quietly, "has finished the work Mr. Cribb began. Flaxborough's sense of propriety is intact." Mally frowned. "You mean Mrs. Withens? Or the vicar? Or perhaps no one at all? Some places have a way of correcting themselves. In Flaxborough, that correction usually arrives disguised as tidiness." He placed the photograph inside the file and closed it with deliberate finality. The act carried a weight beyond procedure. It was the soft click of the world returning to its small, habitual orbit. Rising, he crossed to the window again. The morning had brightened to a gentle haze. Across the square, Mrs. Bullimore was already directing a flower delivery with her usual air of municipal consequence. The church spire rose above the rooftops, steady and pale against the thin blue sky, as if nothing beneath it had ever been disturbed. Purbright watched in silence for a moment, then turned back to his desk. He slid the file into the cabinet, aligning it precisely between the Rudge charity affair and the choir vestry incident. The drawer shut with a sound as soft and final as a sigh. "Well, Mally," he said, reaching for his coat, "I suppose we must make ourselves useful again. I hear there's been a complaint about overhanging rhododendrons in Nightingale Close. A matter of jurisdiction, no doubt." Mally nodded, smiling faintly, and fetched his hat. "I'll drive, sir." "Please do. I find nothing steadies the mind after a resurrection quite like horticulture." They stepped out into the square, the day carrying its ordinary noises. The clatter of hooves from the milk cart, a bicycle bell, the faint murmur of the town resuming its comfortable self-deception. Behind them, the church bell began its slow toll for morning prayers, measured, decorous, and unaware of the secrets buried contentedly at its feet. As they walked toward the car, Purbright looked back once at the spire, its pale silhouette caught in a patch of unexpected sunlight. He gave a small, approving nod, as though satisfied that everything, at last, had returned to its proper place. The inspector's expression was calm, faintly amused, and, as always, unreadable.